My name is Detective James Riley, and I have been working with the New York Police Department for 17 years now, and in all those years, I have seen every kind of domestic violence case you can imagine, but there is one case that will stay with me forever, because it is not just about violence, but about years of silent suffering and about how a gentle woman was pushed so far that she finally fought back. And when I tell you this story, I want you to understand that sometimes victims become defendants, and sometimes self-defense looks like a crime. I met Preeti Sharma on a cold November night in 2018 when we responded to a 911 call from a house in Queens, and when we arrived, we found a chaotic scene, and there was blood on the kitchen floor and a woman lying injured and another woman standing in the corner holding a knife and shaking uncontrollably, and that woman was Preeti, and she looked at us with terrified eyes and said I had to do it, and she was going to kill me, and I had no choice. We arrested Preeti that night and took her to the station, and as I processed her paperwork, I noticed something, and her arms were covered in old scars and burn marks and bruises in various stages of healing, and I had been a cop long enough to recognize the signs of long-term abuse. And so before I formally charged her, I sat down with her and said, Preeti, I need you to tell me everything, and what happened tonight, and what has been happening in that house. Preeti looked at me with eyes that were empty and exhausted, and she said, Detective, do you really want to know? And because if I tell you everything, it will take hours. And I said I have all the time in the world. And so Preeti took a deep breath and began to tell me her story, and over the next 6 hours, I learned about years of torture and suffering and cruelty that would make your blood boil. Preeti Sharma was born in Mumbai, India in 1986, and she came from a middle-class family, and her father was a school teacher, and her mother was a homemaker, and Preeti had always been a bright and ambitious girl, and she studied hard and became a nurse, and she dreamed of coming to America and building a better life, and in 2010, she moved to New York and got a job at a hospital, and she was good at her work, and her patients loved her because she was kind and gentle and caring. Preeti was traditional in many ways, and she believed in family and respect and duty. And when her parents told her in 2012 that they had found a suitable match for her, she agreed to meet the man, and his name was Raj Malhotra, and he was 30 years old and worked as an IT engineer in New York, and he seemed nice enough, and during their meetings, he was polite and respectful, and he told Preeti that he lived with his mother, but that they would have their own space in the house. Preeti agreed to the marriage, and her parents were happy, and the wedding took place in Mumbai with all the traditional ceremonies, and Preeti was nervous but also excited because she thought she was starting a new chapter of her life, and she thought she would have a loving husband and a supportive family, and she had no idea what was waiting for her. When Preeti arrived at the Malhotra house in Queens after the wedding, she met her mother-in-law, Savita Malhotra, for the first time in person, and Savita was 58 years old, and she had sharp features and cold eyes, and from the very first moment, Preeti could feel the hostility radiating from her, and Savita looked Preeti up and down and said, So you are the girl my son married? And then she turned to Raj and said, She looks weak, and I hope she can at least cook properly. That first night, Preeti tried to be friendly and helpful, and she offered to make tea and help with dinner, but Savita snapped at her and said, I do not need your help, and you just stay out of my way. And Preeti was confused and hurt, but she told herself that maybe Savita just needed time to adjust and that eventually they would develop a good relationship. But things did not get better, and they got worse, and from the very first week, Savita began to torture Preeti in small ways, and she would criticize everything Preeti did, and she would say the tea is too sweet, or the food is too salty, or you cleaned the floor wrong, or you folded the clothes wrong, and nothing Preeti did was ever good enough, and Savita would make Preeti redo tasks over and over again until Preeti was exhausted. Savita had rules, and Preeti had to wake up at 5 in the morning and cook breakfast and clean the entire house before Raj and Savita woke up, and if Preeti was even 5 minutes late, Savita would scream at her and call her lazy and useless, and Preeti was working full-time as a nurse, and she would come home exhausted after 12-hour shifts, and Savita would be waiting with a list of chores and would say, I do not care if you are tired, and you are the daughter-in-law, and this is your duty. Raj saw all of this, but he said nothing, and when Preeti tried to talk to him about his mother's behavior, he would say, "You need to adjust, and she is my mother, and she is set in her ways, and you are young, and you need to learn to respect your elders." And Preeti felt trapped because in her culture, you are supposed to respect your husband and respect your in-laws, and she thought maybe Raj was right, and maybe she just needed to try harder. After 3 months, Savita's verbal abuse escalated, and she started calling Preeti names. And she would say, "You are a worthless girl, and you are a burden, and I never wanted my son to marry you, and you are not good enough for this family." And these words cut deep into Preeti's heart, but she stayed silent because she thought that is what a good daughter-in-law should do. Then Savita started to control Preeti's money, and Preeti was working as a nurse and earning a decent salary. But Savita demanded that Preeti hand over her entire paycheck. And Savita said in this house, the daughter-in-law does not keep money, and everything belongs to the family, and Preeti gave her the money because Raj told her to, and Savita would give Preeti maybe $20 a week for personal expenses, and Preeti could not even buy herself basic necessities. Savita also isolated Preeti from her family, and whenever Preeti's parents called from India, Savita would take the phone away and would say, "You cannot talk for more than 5 minutes, and we do not have money for long international calls." And if Preeti tried to call her parents on her own, Savita would find out and would punish her by making her clean the house 3 times or by not giving her food. 6 months into the marriage, Savita's abuse became physical, and it started small, and Savita would grab Preeti's arm roughly and would twist it and would say, "You are not listening to me." And then one day when Preeti accidentally dropped a plate, Savita slapped her hard across the face, and Preeti stood there in shock with her cheek burning, and Savita said, "If you break things in my house, I will break you." Preeti ran to Raj crying and showed him the red mark on her face and said, "Your mother hit me," and Raj looked uncomfortable and said she probably did not mean it, and maybe you provoked her, and Preeti could not believe what she was hearing. And she said, "I dropped a plate by accident," and Raj said, "Just be more careful next time," and he walked away, and that was when Preeti realized that her husband would never protect her. The physical abuse got worse, and Savita would pull Preeti's hair and would push her and would pinch her hard enough to leave bruises, and she was careful to hit Preeti in places that would be covered by clothes, and she would burn Preeti with hot spoons on her arms and back and would say, "If you tell anyone, I will say you are lying and no one will believe you." Preeti thought about leaving, but she had no money, and Savita had taken her passport and all her important documents and hidden them, and Preeti did not know where they were, and she was too ashamed to tell her parents what was happening, because in her culture divorce is shameful, and she thought her parents would blame her and say she should have tried harder to adjust. In 2014, Preeti discovered she was pregnant, and when she told Raj, he was happy and said, "This is good news." And Preeti hoped that maybe the baby would change things and maybe Savita would be kinder to her, but instead, Savita became crueler, and she would say, "If you have a girl, I will kick you out of this house, and this family needs a boy." During her pregnancy, Preeti was not allowed to rest, and Savita made her do all the housework and carry heavy things, and Preeti begged Savita to let her see a doctor regularly, but Savita would say, "Doctors are expensive, and you do not need to go every month," and Preeti was terrified that something would happen to her baby, but she had no way to get help. Preeti gave birth to a healthy baby boy in 2014, and they named him Arush, and when Savita saw that it was a boy, she was pleased, and she said, "Finally something good came from you," and Preeti thought that now things would improve, but instead, Savita did something even crueler, and she took the baby away from Preeti. Savita would not let Preeti hold Arush or feed him or take care of him, and she would say, "I am his grandmother, and I know better than you how to raise a child, and you are too stupid, and you will do something wrong." And Preeti would hear her baby crying and would want to go to him, but Savita would lock Preeti in her room and would take care of Arush herself. Preeti was only allowed to see Arush for brief periods when Savita permitted it, and she was allowed to breastfeed him, but only when Savita decided it was time, and Preeti felt like she was losing her mind, because what kind of mother cannot take care of her own child? And she would cry and beg Raj to intervene, but Raj would say, "My mother knows best, and she raised me, and Arush will be fine." As Irish grew older, Savita programmed him to ignore Preeti, and she would tell Irish that Preeti was not a good mother and that grandmother was the only one who loved him, and Irish started calling Savita Mama and calling Preeti by her first name, and it broke Preeti's heart every single day. Savita also forced Preeti to quit her nursing job, and she said, "You need to stay home and take care of the house, and you do not need to work." And Preeti lost her independence and her income and her connection to the outside world, and she was completely trapped in that house with no escape. The isolation became total, and Savita took away Preeti's phone and said, "You do not need to talk to anyone outside this house," and Preeti had no friends and no family nearby and no one to turn to, and she was completely alone with her abusers. In 2016, Preeti noticed that she was getting sick frequently, and she would have stomach pains and nausea and dizziness, and she thought maybe it was stress, but it kept getting worse. And one day she found a small bottle of cleaning chemical hidden in the kitchen cabinet, and there were drops of it on the counter near where her food was prepared, and Preeti realized with horror that Savita was poisoning her. Preeti confronted Savita and said, "Are you putting something in my food?" And Savita smiled coldly and said, "You have an overactive imagination, and maybe you are just weak and sickly." And Preeti knew that Savita was slowly trying to kill her, but she had no proof and no one to tell. Preeti tried to be extra careful about what she ate and tried to prepare her own food, but Savita watched her constantly and would contaminate anything Preeti touched, and Preeti started losing weight and getting weaker, and she knew she was dying. Slowly, but she did not know how to stop it. The only thing that kept Preeti alive was Arash, and even though he called Savita Mama, and even though he barely knew, Preeti loved him desperately, and she thought, "I cannot leave my son alone with these people, and I need to survive for him." And that thought alone kept her going through years of torture. By 2018, Preeti had been suffering for 6 years, and she was a shell of the person she used to be, and she was thin and pale and covered in scars and burns and bruises, and her spirit was broken, and she moved through the house like a ghost doing whatever Savita commanded without question, because she had learned that resistance only brought more pain. But there was a small part of Preeti that was still alive deep inside, and it was the part that loved Arash and wanted to protect him, and that part was watching and waiting and gathering strength. One night in October 2018, 4-year-old Arash developed a high fever, and he was crying and burning up, and Preeti checked his temperature, and it was 104 degrees, and she knew they needed to take him to the hospital immediately. And she went to Savita and said, "We need to take Arash to the emergency room right now, and his fever is too high." Savita waved her hand dismissively and said, "It is just a fever, and children get fevers all the time, and he will be fine in the morning." And Preeti said, "No, this is serious, and we need to go now." And Savita's eyes narrowed, and she said, "Are you telling me what to do?" In my own house, Preeti felt something shift inside her, and for the first time in 6 years, she raised her voice and said, "I am his mother, and I am taking him to the hospital." And Savita stood up and walked toward Preeti and slapped her hard across the face and said, "You are nothing, and you are not his mother, and I am his mother, and you will do what I say." Preeti put her hand to her burning cheek, and something in her snapped, and she said, "No, and I am taking my son to the hospital, and you cannot stop me." And Savita's face turned purple with rage, and she screamed, "How dare you speak to me like this?" And she walked to the stove, where a pot of oil was heating, and she picked it up, and before Preeti could react, Savita threw the hot oil at her. The oil hit Preeti's back and shoulder, and the pain was excruciating, and Preeti screamed and fell to the floor, and her skin was burning and blistering, and Savita stood over her and said, "Next time I will throw it in your face, and then we will see how brave you are." Raj was in the bedroom, and he heard the scream, but he did not come out, and Preeti lay on the floor crying and in pain, and she looked at Arash, who was crying in his crib, and she looked at Savita, who was smiling with satisfaction, and something changed in Preeti forever. That night after Savita went to bed, Preeti sat in the dark kitchen, with her back covered in burns, and she realized that she was going to die in this house, and either Savita would succeed in poisoning her or she would kill her in a fit of rage, and no one would help her, and no one would save her, and if she died, Arash would be raised by this monster, and she could not let that happen. Preeti made a decision that night. and she decided that she would not die quietly, and she decided that she would gather evidence and she would expose what was happening, and she would save herself and her son, and even if it meant breaking the law, she would do whatever it took to survive. The next day, Preeti went to work, and even though her back was covered in burns, and she was in terrible pain, she did not show it, and during her lunch break, she went to an electronics store and used the little money she had saved by skipping meals, and she bought 3 tiny spy cameras that looked like buttons, and she hid them in her purse. Over the next 3 months, Preeti carefully placed these cameras in different parts of the house, and she put one in the kitchen, and one in the hallway, and one in the living room, and the cameras were motion activated, and they recorded everything, and every day Preeti would download the footage to a hidden memory card that she kept sewn into the lining of her purse. The cameras captured everything, and they captured Savita, hitting Preeti and pulling her hair and burning her with hot objects, and they captured Savita, putting unknown substances in Preeti's food, and they captured Savita screaming abuse and threats, and they captured Raj watching and doing nothing, and Preeti saved every single video. Preeti also started secretly going to a doctor, and she told the doctor that she suspected she was being poisoned, and the doctor ran tests and found traces of toxic substances in her blood, and the doctor said, "You need to go to the police." And Preeti said, "I am gathering evidence and I will go soon." And the doctor documented everything and gave Preeti copies of all the medical reports. Preeti found her passport and documents that Savita had hidden, and she made copies of everything. And she contacted a domestic violence shelter and explained her situation. And they said, "When you are ready to leave, we will help you and we will keep you safe." And Preeti said, "I am not ready yet, and I need more evidence, and I need to make sure that woman goes to prison for what she has done." By January 2018, Preeti had 47 videos and 23 audio recordings and medical reports and photographs of her injuries, and she had documented financial fraud showing that Savita had stolen over $80,000 from her over 6 years, and she had evidence of everything, and she was ready. But before Preeti could execute her plan, something happened that forced her hand, and one night in November 2018, Raj was working late, and Preeti was in the kitchen cleaning, and Savita came in, and she had been drinking, and she was in a rage about something, and she started screaming at Preeti, calling her worthless and disgusting. Preeti tried to ignore her and kept washing dishes, and this made Savita angrier, and she grabbed Preeti by the hair and yanked her head back and said, "You think you are too good to answer me?" And Preeti said, "Quietly, please let me go." And Savita said, "I am going to teach you a lesson you will never forget." Savita went to the drawer and pulled out a large kitchen knife, and she held it up and said, "I am going to cut that pretty face of yours, and then no one will ever want to look at you again." And Preeti saw the madness in Savita's eyes and knew that this time she really meant to hurt her badly or kill her. Preeti backed away from Savita, who was advancing toward her with the knife, and Preeti's heart was pounding, and she knew this was life or death, and Savita lunged at Preeti and slashed the knife toward her face. And Preeti jumped back, and the knife missed her by inches, and Savita screamed, "You cannot run from me, and this is my house." Preeti ran around the kitchen table trying to keep distance between them, and Savita was chasing her and swinging the knife wildly, and Preeti was crying and begging, "Please, stop, and please do not do this." And Savita said, "I should have done this years ago, and you have been nothing but trouble since you came into this house." During the struggle, Preeti grabbed a chair and held it between herself and Savita slashed at the chair, and the knife got stuck in the wood for a moment, and Preeti used that moment to push the chair hard into Savita, and Savita fell backward, and the knife flew out of her hand and skittered across the floor. Both women dove for the knife, and Preeti got there first, and she grabbed it and held it in her shaking hands, and Savita got up, and her face was twisted with rage, and she said, "Give me that knife, and you do not have the courage to use it." And Preeti said, "Stay back, and I will call the police." And Savita laughed and said, "The police? And you think anyone will believe? You and I will tell them you attacked me, and they will believe me, not you." Savita moved toward Preeti again and said, "Give me that knife right now." And Preeti held it out in front of her and said, "I am warning you, stay back." And Savita said, "Or what? And you are too weak and too pathetic." And she lunged at Preeti, trying to grab the knife, and in the struggle, Preeti felt the knife connect with flesh, and she heard Savita gasp. Preeti pulled back and saw blood on the knife and on Savita's arm, and Savita looked down at the wound and then looked at Preeti with shock and disbelief and said, "You cut me, and you actually cut me." And Savita came at Preeti again, even more enraged, and said, "I will kill you for that." And the two women struggled, and Preeti was defending herself and trying to push Savita away, and in the chaos, the knife connected again, this time with Savita's stomach. Savita stumbled backward and fell to the floor, and blood was spreading across her clothes, and she looked up at Preeti with hatred and said, "You will go to prison for this, and you will never see your son again." And Preeti dropped the knife, and her hands were shaking, and she said, "Oh, God, what have I done?" But then Preeti remembered 6 years of torture, and she remembered the burns, and the beatings, and the poison, and she remembered being separated from her son, and she remembered that this woman had just tried to kill her. And Preeti picked up her phone and called 911, and she said, "My mother-in-law attacked me with a knife, and I defended myself, and I need an ambulance, and I need the police." While waiting for the police, Preeti took towels and tried to stop Savita's bleeding, because despite everything, she was still a nurse, and she could not watch someone die, even someone who had tortured her. And Savita was conscious, and she kept saying, "You are finished, and wait until my son gets home." And Preeti said quietly, "I have evidence, and I have proof of everything you did to me, and this ends tonight." The police arrived within minutes, and that is when I met Preeti, and we arrested her and took her to the station. And after she told me her story, I said, "Preeti, you said you have evidence, and can you show it to me?" And Preeti nodded and gave me the memory card and said, "Detective, everything is on here, and 6 years of abuse, and you will see what kind of monster that woman is." I took the memory card and went to our tech department and had them load the videos, and I started watching, and what I saw made me sick to my stomach. And there was video after video of Savita hitting Preeti and burning her and throwing things at her and screaming the most vile abuse. And there were videos of Savita putting substances in Preeti's food, and videos of her taking money from Preeti's purse, and there were videos of Raj watching and doing nothing. I watched 47 videos and listened to 23 audio recordings. And by the end, I understood exactly why Preeti had finally fought back, and I went back to the interrogation room and I said, "Preeti, I believe you, and everything you told me is true, and we are going to investigate this fully." And Preeti started crying and said, "Thank you, and thank you for believing me, and no one has believed me in 6 years." We sent the videos to the district attorney's office, and we also executed a search warrant on the Malhotra house, and we found the hidden cameras still in place, and we found bottles of cleaning chemicals and rat poison in places where food was prepared, and we found Preeti's passport and documents hidden in Savita's bedroom, and we found financial records showing that Savita had been stealing Preeti's paychecks for years. We also brought Preeti to the hospital and had doctors photograph and document all of her injuries, and there were burn scars on her arms and back, and there were healed fractures, and there were bruises in various stages of healing, and the medical examiner said these injuries are consistent with long-term systematic abuse, and some of these scars are years old. Based on all of this evidence, the district attorney made a decision, and they charged Savita Malhotra with multiple counts, including aggravated assault and battery and attempted murder and false imprisonment and financial fraud and criminal conspiracy. And they also charged Raj Malhotra as an accomplice because he had knowledge of the abuse and did nothing to stop it. Preeti was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, but the DA said they would review the case for self-defense, and after looking at all the evidence, they agreed that Preeti had acted in self-defense, and they said, "We will present the evidence to a grand jury and let them decide." Savita survived her injuries, and she was released from the hospital after 2 weeks, and she was immediately arrested and taken into custody, and when we arrested her, she screamed that Preeti was a liar and that Preeti had attacked her for no reason, and she said, "I am an old woman, and that girl is crazy, and you need to lock her up, not me." We showed Savita the videos and said, "Mrs. Malhotra, we have evidence of everything and 6 years of abuse recorded on camera," and Savita's face went pale, and she said those videos are fake, and Preeti made them up, and her lawyer told her to be quiet and said, "We will fight this in court." The case became big news in the Indian American community, and it sparked conversations. about domestic abuse and about the treatment of daughters-in-law in traditional families, and some people supported Preeti and said she was a victim who had fought back, and other people said she should have just left and that she was wrong to use violence. The grand jury reviewed all the evidence, and they voted not to indict Preeti for assault, and they ruled that she had acted in clear self-defense. And the DA dismissed all charges against her, and Preeti was free. But her legal troubles were not over, because now she had to fight for custody of her son. Raj had filed for full custody of Arush, claiming that Preeti was dangerous and unstable, and the custody battle was brutal, and Raj's lawyers tried to paint Preeti as violent and unfit to be a mother, and they said she had attacked an elderly woman with a knife and she could not be trusted around children. But Preeti's lawyer presented all the evidence of abuse and showed the videos in family court, and the judge watched video after video of Savita torturing Preeti, and the judge also saw how Raj had enabled the abuse and done nothing to protect his wife, and the judge said, "This is one of the worst cases of domestic abuse I have ever seen, and there is no question that Mrs. Sharma was the victim here." The judge ruled that Preeti would get full custody of Arush and that Raj would be allowed supervised visitation only, and the judge also ordered Raj to pay child support and to attend domestic violence education classes, and Preeti was so relieved because she had been terrified that she would lose her son. Meanwhile, Savita's trial began, and it was a high-profile case, and the courtroom was packed with reporters and members of the Indian-American community. And Savita sat at the defense table looking frail and elderly, and her lawyers tried to portray her as a confused old woman who had been attacked by her ungrateful daughter-in-law. But the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, and they showed the videos to the jury, and many jury members were crying as they watched Savita burn Preeti with hot spoons and pull her hair and beat her and throw hot oil on her, and they heard Savita's voice screaming abuse and threats, and there was no way to deny what was on those recordings. The prosecution also brought in medical experts who testified about Preeti's injuries and about the long-term physical and psychological effects of sustained abuse, and they brought in a toxicologist who testified that Preeti had been systematically poisoned over a period of years, and that if it had continued, she would likely have died. Preeti testified at the trial, and she described 6 years of torture in detail, and she told the jury about being isolated and controlled and beaten and poisoned, and about having her son taken away from her, and about living in constant fear for her life. And by the time she finished testifying, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom. Savita's lawyers tried to argue that the videos were taken out of context and that what looked like abuse was just normal family discipline, and they tried to argue that Preeti was exaggerating and that she could have left at any time but chose to stay, and the prosecution destroyed these arguments by showing that Preeti had no access to money and no documents and no way to leave. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours, and they found Savita Malhotra guilty on all counts, including attempted murder for the poisoning and for the attack with the knife. And when the verdict was read, Savita showed no emotion, and she just sat there staring straight ahead. At sentencing, the judge said, "Mrs. Malhotra, you tortured your daughter-in-law for 6 years, and you treated her worse than an animal, and you tried to kill her multiple times, and you showed no remorse and no mercy, and therefore this court will show you none." And the judge sentenced Savita to 16 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for at least 12 years. Raj Malhotra was tried separately, and he was found guilty of being an accomplice to domestic abuse and of failing to report a crime and of child endangerment because he had allowed the abuse to continue in a home where his son lived. And he was sentenced to 4 years in prison, and after he served his time, he would be on probation for 5 years. Preeti filed for divorce, and it was granted immediately, and she was awarded full custody of Arush and ownership of the house in Queens, and she was also awarded a significant financial settlement because Savita had stolen years of her income. After the trial was over, I met with Preeti one last time, and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, "Detective, I am still healing, and my body has healed, but my mind and my heart will take longer, but I am free, and my son is with me, and that is all that matters." And I asked if she regretted fighting back, and she said no, and if I had not defended myself that night, I would be dead and Savita would have gotten away with everything. Preeti told me that she had started attending therapy and was working through the trauma of what she had endured. And she said it is hard, because for 6 years I was told I was worthless and stupid and useless, and I started to believe it. And now I have to learn to see myself differently and to understand that I am a survivor, not a victim. I asked Preeti what her plans were for the future, and she said, I want to help other women who are going through what I went through, and I want to start an organization that helps immigrant women escape abusive situations. And I want to make sure that no other woman suffers in silence the way I did. Preeti did exactly that, and she founded an organization called Silent Voices that provides support and resources to immigrant women facing domestic abuse, and the organization helps women find safe housing and legal representation and medical care, and it helps them navigate the complex process of leaving an abusive situation. Preeti also started speaking publicly about her experience, and she gave talks at community centers and women's groups, and she shared her story to raise awareness about domestic abuse in immigrant communities, and she talked about the cultural pressures that keep women silent and about the importance of speaking up and seeking help. Today, Preeti is 38 years old, and she lives in a small apartment in Queens with her 10-year-old son, Arush, and she has rebuilt her life from nothing. And she went back to nursing and now works at a hospital helping other trauma victims, and Arush is thriving, and he no longer calls Savita Mama, and he understands now that Preeti is his real mother and that she fought to protect him. Arush does not see Savita, and Savita is in prison and will be there for many more years, and Arush sees his father Raj occasionally for supervised visits, but Raj has never apologized for failing to protect Preeti, and Preeti has no interest in reconciling with him. Savita is currently serving her sentence at a women's correctional facility in upstate New York, and she has shown no remorse for her actions. And in fact, she has written letters claiming that she is the victim and that she was wrongly convicted, and other inmates who know her story say that she still talks about how ungrateful Preeti was, and she still does not understand what she did wrong. I have stayed in touch with Preeti over the years, and I have watched her transform from a broken, frightened woman into a strong, confident survivor, and she has taken her pain and turned it into purpose, and she has helped dozens of other women escape similar situations, and I am proud to know her. This case taught me something important about domestic abuse and about how it can happen to anyone regardless of education or intelligence or strength, and Preeti was a trained medical professional, and she was smart and capable, and yet she was trapped in that house for 6 years because the abuse was systematic, and because she was isolated, and because the cultural and social pressures made her feel like she had no way out. I also learned that abuse is not always immediately visible, and Preeti went to work every day and smiled at her patients and did her job, and no one knew what was happening to her at home, and that is the insidious nature of domestic abuse, and it hides in plain sight, and victims become very good at hiding their pain because they are ashamed or afraid or both. What happened to Preeti was not unique, and there are thousands of women in immigrant communities who suffer similar abuse, and they are told that they must respect their elders and honor their families and sacrifice themselves for the good of everyone else, and they are taught that speaking up is disrespectful and that leaving is shameful, and so they suffer in silence. Preeti's case also highlighted problems in our system, and she had been abused for 6 years, and no one noticed, and not her co-workers or her neighbors or her doctors, and she had visible injuries, and yet no one asked questions, and no one offered help, and we need to do better as a society at recognizing the signs of abuse and reaching out to potential victims. I think about that night in November 2018, when Preeti finally fought back, and I think about how close she came to dying. And if Savita had succeeded in killing her that night, it would have been ruled an accident, and Savita would have claimed that Preeti attacked her and she defended herself, and no one would have questioned it because Savita was the mother-in-law, and mothers-in-law are supposed to be respected. But Preeti survived, and she fought back, and she exposed the truth, and she made sure that Savita faced justice, and in doing so, she gave a voice to thousands of other silent victims. And she showed that it is possible to escape and to rebuild and to thrive. I want to end by saying that if you are in an abusive situation, please know that you are not alone, and there are people who will help you. And there are organizations like Preeti's Silent Voices that exist specifically to help women. Like you escape, and you do not have to suffer in silence, and you do not have to endure abuse because of cultural expectations or family pressure. Your life matters and your safety matters and your well-being matters, and no one has the right to hurt you or control you or diminish you. And if you are being abused, please reach out to someone and call a domestic violence hotline or talk to a trusted friend or coworker or doctor and take that first step toward freedom. Preeti Sharma is a survivor and she is a fighter, and she is proof that even after years of abuse, it is possible to reclaim your life and find your voice and help others. And her story is not just about one woman's suffering, but about the strength of the human spirit and about the importance of believing victims and holding abusers accountable. Thank you for listening to this story. And if it resonated with you, please share it, because someone you know might be suffering in silence and might need to hear that. Escape is possible, and if you want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe, because there are many more that need to be told and many more voices that